So it's a pleasure to talk to everybody tonight. I'm really pleased to see so many of you have come along, because of course, what else would you do on World Curlew Day but come along and hear some people talk about curlew. So this evening, I'm going to talk about curlew at a crossroads. So this talk used to be called Curlew in Crisis, but I kind of feel like we're at a point where we might be reaching that crossroads, because I very much feel that we do actually have hope for their conservation now, with everybody working together, as Mary has so eloquently described. So the call of the curlew is very much a herald of spring. In fact, many of you might be hearing it in your landscapes right now, and it really embodies a relationship with the landscapes of the British Isles. And it's been said that if we lose the curlew, we might even lose the sound of the British countryside and lose a species that's been a cultural icon across the British Isles for centuries. Across our islands, curlew are being lost from the countryside in spring, unfortunately, and this is risking the species becoming just a feature of folklores and stories for future generations. Over the past 20 to 25 years or so, the UK has lost half of our breeding curlew, and on the island of Ireland especially, the outlook is particularly bleak, with the future of the species potentially looking at extinction within the next decade or two. But the situation is equally dire across Europe, and indeed really globally, because the majority of the species actually breed in Europe. Curlew are listed by the IUCN's Red List as near threatened, and in Europe they're listed as vulnerable, with declines of 30 to 50% depending on country over the last 30 years or so. In this map, the size of the arrow represents the relative size of the population per country, and then the darker red colors represent greater declines. And you can see here that the UK hosts one of the largest breeding populations of the species, behind only Russia and Finland. It has quite a large arrow, and that's estimated at about 59,000 breeding pairs in 2020. But as you can see, it's also one of the most quickly declining populations in Europe. And this is of particular importance because about a fifth to a quarter of the global population breeds in the UK. And that's about a quarter to a third of the entire European population. So we really have a global imperative here in the UK for us to take action to conserve the species as a whole. And as Mary said, they were red listed in the UK in 2015, and they've been called by many the greatest conservation priority that we have here. So in the British Isles, the recent bird atlas from between 2007 and 11 shows that breeding curlew are actually quite broadly distributed across our country. But if we look at this map showing where they're most numerous, they're most abundant in the uplands, predominantly breeding on moorland bog and heath and nearby grassland habitats. But there are also some lowland breeding curlew in dry lowland heath and grassland, for example, here in East Anglia, in Breckland, where the BTO is, and also in the New Forest, where Russ is based. But by far and away, the strongholds for curlew with the highest breeding concentrations are in northern England, so the Pennines in eastern Scotland, and the northern and the Western Isles. Unfortunately, the atlas paints a pretty grim story of curlew declines across the British Isles over the last 25 years. So the black rectangles in this map show 10-kilometer survey squares where curlew were detected in the 1990 atlas, but not in the 2010 atlas. So you can see extensive, complete losses of curlew throughout Ireland and northwest Scotland, and losses throughout much of Wales and southern England as well. But if we look at this change in numbers using the atlas, the picture becomes even worse, with blue showing declines across the board. So there's extensive losses in numbers throughout much of Ireland and Wales and Scotland, despite still being present in some of those areas. And while there are a few little orange splodges on the map indicating a few small gains, in general, those aren't enough to compensate for wider losses, particularly in areas which are considered strongholds. Mary showed a similar graph to this one. When we look at how the population has changed over time using BTO's long-term monitoring data sets of breeding birds, we can see that 50 to 60 years ago in the post-war period, they were doing okay. So they spread down from the uplands throughout the British lowlands in the early 20th century into low-intensity agricultural areas, which were farmed with hay meadows. But since the sort of post-war sort of agricultural intensification boom in the mid-1970s or so, like so many other farmland birds, they've undergone quite a dramatic decline and have been in steady decline ever since. And unlike some other species, which might be doing better in some parts of the UK compared to others, these declines really are across the board. So in England, Scotland, Wales, and most certainly Northern Ireland, and also Ireland as well. But of course, it's not just curlew. We shouldn't forget it's all waders as well, which are doing really poorly across the board. So lapwing in particular have been on conservationist radar for quite a long time. But despite its charisma and quite iconic status, until recently, we've had quite remarkably little understanding of what's causing curlew population declines. So curlew numbers are the product of kind of two demographic factors, if you like. Breeding success on the one hand, which combines nest and chick survival, and then survival of adults and juvenile birds. Now, while adult survival is quite well defined from bird ringing studies, the survival of young birds after independence from the adults is quite a big question mark, as that's a really difficult measure for scientists to quantify. Breeding adult survival in curlew is very high. And so because of this very high survival, they don't have to produce a lot of chicks to achieve population stability. So previous estimates have shown that in the UK, a pair has to produce roughly, say, 2 chicks every 3 years or so for population stability. But there's a lot of evidence that indicates that declines are a result of poor breeding success. So while stability might be this about 2 chicks every 3 years or so, in reality, in many parts of the UK, success is more like 2 chicks every 6 to 10 years. So much below what it needs to be for population stability, never mind recovery. So what are the reasons for this poor breeding success? Well, habitat loss or degradation has been identified as one of the primary drivers of declines. So particularly in lowland and some marginal upland areas, a primary cause is agricultural intensification. So for example, the conversion of natural grasslands to arable agriculture. So this can lead to outright loss of breeding sites, of breeding nest sites. And given curlew are incredibly site faithful to their nesting sites, bird might just completely abandon breeding attempts if their nesting area is lost. Or alternatively, it can lead to failed breeding attempts because even if nests hatch in arable landscapes, there might be little food for chicks, or it might be of poorer quality. So they either have to travel a long way or they have to make themselves more obvious to predators while trying to find food. And there can also be outright losses of nests and chicks to agricultural operations. Intensification can also include grassland improvement. So from sort of damp, rough grassland or species-rich hay meadows to a more uniform, intensive ryegrass monoculture. And so while nesting habitat might still be largely appropriate, so it's still grass, it might be inappropriate for nests and chicks with either the wrong structure for nests or it's too dense and tall for chicks to be able to move through to forage effectively. In addition to this lack of vegetation diversity through conversion to monoculture, intensification can also result in increased drainage of the land as well, as Mary mentioned. So it's both this lack of diversity in drier habitat means poorer food availability for chicks. And this type of improvement can also often mean a conversion from traditional hay meadows to silage. And this brings with it a more intensive mowing regime and then consequently result in the loss of both nests and chicks to agricultural machinery. In the uplands, it's a little bit of a different story, both in the outright uplands and marginal upland areas. So here, afforestation, so planting of woodland, either for commercial forestry or otherwise, and also peat extraction can result in the outright loss or degradation of core breeding habitats, as well as increased drainage resulting in habitat degradation, resulting in poor food quality for chicks. And afforestation, as Mary mentioned, also has the additional knock-on consequence of harboring predators. So it can increase predation pressure by acting as a predator reservoir. And there's a substantial amount of evidence now to suggest that predation of nests and chicks is probably the single biggest factor hampering breeding success around the country. And while this is undoubtedly the primary proximate driver of declines, it's a symptom of wider problems. So for example, the large number of generalist mesopredators in our landscape and why that might be. A recent study has shown that the UK has some of the highest densities of these predators like corvids and foxes and stoats and weasels, of any European country. As I've also mentioned, habitat degradation makes nests and chicks more susceptible to predation. So, for example, it can make nests easier to find in a less kind of structurally complex landscape, or can cause chicks to behave in ways that make them more susceptible to predation. So instead of spending time hiding like this chick here, if they're hungry, they might feed in more short grass habitats or make themselves more obvious than they otherwise would. For example, these chicks which are feeding on really, really short vegetation habitat. So while it can be a controversial subject, the reality is that predator control can act as a kind of short-term sticking plaster solution, if you like, to reduce predation pressure. But it does have to be legal, it has to be proportionate, it has to be justifiable. And it's really one measure deployed in a suite of tools. There's no point in controlling predators if the habitat isn't going to be right for the birds in the area in which you've controlled predators in the first place. But it really is logistically difficult. It's awfully expensive to roll out at a sufficient intensity and wide enough scale in the landscape to have effect. And so it's quite difficult to achieve the effectiveness that you need to make a difference for curlew. And there's evidence from several studies that game bird management and the associated intensive control of predators can in fact benefit breeding curlew and other ground nesting birds, including other wader species. Another measure that has been used is predator exclusion. So, for example, you can use fences to protect nests. So this top image is one from Shropshire in Curlew country. That's around a single nest, but you can also protect at a much larger scale, like this fence on the Neen Washes for Project Godwit. And if it's deployed at a large enough scale, this can protect chicks as well. But again, fencing is really logistically difficult. It's expensive and it's virtually impossible to roll out at scale across the countryside. So ultimately, I think solving the predation pressure problem is going to mean dealing with some of the questions around why there are so many predators in the British countryside and improving overall habitat quality to protect nests and chicks as well. So this is kind of a very broad brush picture of the main factors which affect curlew across the country. With habitat change and predation pressure, kind of the two biggest immediate issues, and climate change and emerging future kind of pressure. But their relative importance can vary quite a little bit regionally and even at quite small scales as well. And so there's a huge value in local studies because curlew are so varied in the habitats that they occupy around the country. And these local studies can tell us more about what local populations are doing and what the mechanisms are that are most important for those populations, and then therefore what the most effective conservation solutions are in those habitats and locations and why. So in other words, what works where and why. So as Mary alluded to, the good news for curlews and other waders is that there are an awful lot of people and organisations on the case, both in the UK and Ireland. Over the last 5 years especially, there has been a huge proliferation of studies, which the BTO summarised in a now outdated audit from 2019. And these range from local community-led projects to ones led by some of the big nature NGOs or university projects, and really everything in between. And many of these are collaborative partnerships, so often across different stakeholder groups, ranging from farmers to universities, to NGOs, and they provide a real exemplar of what can be achieved if we all work together for waders. So I'll just give a really brief tour of some of these projects BTO has been involved in. So the first is a project in Eastern England, which is a collaboration with the University of East Anglia, where Harry Ewing, my PhD student, is studying curlew breeding in Breckland in Eastern England. So this is specifically investigating curlew nest success and chick habitat use and adult sort of spatial behavior using GPS tagging. And most of his sites are MOD land, private estates and Thetford Forest, and habitats, span a really wide variety from airfields to kind of arable sugar beet fields to sort of more traditional dry grass heathland habitats. And in Harry's first field season in 2019, he identified 74 pairs of curlew across his study sites and estimates that there could be as many as 150 pairs of this population in Breckland. And he found 67 nests. However, his first year of field research suggests that the Breckland population is subject to many of the same pressures as others, so particularly predation pressure, with about 2/3 of his nests failing before hatch because of predation, mainly fox predation. So he found that nest success appears to be higher in fenced and arable areas particularly. which is, fencing makes sense, but the arable finding was quite novel and interesting as to why that might be. But he's found through observational field work last year in his kind of curtailed field season because of the pandemic, he found that appropriate habitat nearby is really necessary for survival of chicks through to fledging, suggesting that they need a mix of vegetation structure in which to forage and to hide and to shelter from the sun in order to be able to fledge successfully. And he's out in the field right now gathering more data with a particular focus this year on getting more information on chick habitat use. In Wales, my colleagues Rachel Taylor and Catherine Badgen have been undertaking a project to look at habitat use of curlew using GPS tracking together with the RSPB and Natural Resources Wales. So over 3 years, they've tagged 25 or so birds of both sexes in 3 different landscapes during the breeding season. And most birds were caught early on in the breeding season. So the tagging data has shown habitat use across the full breeding period. So right through from before birds actually lay eggs to once they either fail or successfully fledge chicks. And this has really interesting implications for curlew in Wales, because their data have shown that birds in different habitats really do quite different things and they prefer different habitats. So for example, birds that breed on upland bog preferred this and foraged on improved grassland when they weren't incubating, but those that bred on lowland grassland and Anglesey avoided improved grassland entirely and preferred kind of unimproved or semi-improved grassland. But generally in most areas, a mosaic of habitats were really what was needed for breeding curlew, and this differed depending on which landscape they were embedded in. Birds were only loosely territorial, so while the nesting site itself was constrained, they traveled really widely, even when incubating or when they were off duty. Presumably, they were traveling around to meet their own needs. And this work has particularly shown that a current kind of field by field or by farm agri-environment policy present across much of the UK really isn't actually suitable for curlew and delivering what they need, because they need good habitat on landscape scale. And this then shows the importance of delivering favorable land management through this kind of cross-community or network approach to land management. And finally, we've also been working with stakeholders to engage them in wader monitoring. This is work that's been mainly led by my colleagues in BTO Scotland. So in Wensleydale and the Yorkshire Dales, we trialled wader monitoring by farmers and gamekeepers back in 2017, together with the National Park Authority and Bolton Estate. And here we had gamekeeper trapline surveys, which were designed to fit in with their daily work plan. And these provided similar results compared to surveys that were conducted at the same time by a professional surveyor. That was really good news. We found that keepers were really skilled nest finders. Actually, they, very, very in tune with the wildlife on their patch, and they deployed cameras and temperature loggers to monitor nests as well. In the Eastern Cairngorms, we've been working with members of the East Cairngorms Moorland Partnership, which includes the National Park Authority and 6 estates, which encompasses a huge area in the Cairngorms. And we've been training and trialing methods where estate workers are going to go out and gather monitoring data on breeding waders, and then these data are then used to answer research questions and get a better understanding of wader productivity in the Scottish uplands, which is an area which is really difficult to monitor otherwise. And we found some additional benefits of this work. It's really, this collaborative approach has served to kind of empower local advocates for waders, and these are advocates which have traditionally been excluded from many conservation narratives. And at the same time, it's contributed to more informed decision-making across different stakeholder groups, and importantly, shared ownership of the outcomes and belief in the evidence, which ultimately is going to be really important for delivering curlew conservation across the UK. This year, we're also rolling out more widely BTO's wader calendar survey, which is aimed specifically at engaging farmers in weekly wader monitoring. So it's a really simple monitoring survey, which they can pin up a data sheet in their tractor cab or on their kitchen fridge or what have you, and just report weekly what waders they see when they're out working the land. We're really pleased to be part of the Curlew Recovery Partnership in England, and there are several different partnership but similar partnership initiatives in both Scotland and Wales. And this is really important in emphasising that partnership at all levels, across all sectors, all different stakeholder groups is going to be very key to success. And finally, we mustn't forget that curlew conservation has to also happen at an international scale. So while our British curlew might migrate quite at small scales primarily, often just within the British Isles, but occasionally further abroad, we receive huge numbers of migrants in the wintertime from elsewhere in northwestern Europe. And the importance of this international partnership has been particularly highlighted by the recent issue of the French hunting ban on curlew, which is an issue that might continue to rear its head in future. And so curlew conservation for the global future of the species really depends on partnerships and collaborations across Europe as well, which happily are well underway also. So I'd just like to thank my colleagues at BTO, University of East Anglia, the Yorkshire Dales and Eastern Cairngorms, and also, of course, many of you who are curlew practitioners, researchers and aficionados. So thanks very much, and I'll hand back to Russ